In a previous video, I was able to show how St. John's use of the word cosmos in the first chapter of his Gospel was used to record, amongst other things, the exact diameter and circumference of the earth. But what about Moses and Genesis? Was there perhaps some cosmology tied up in the opening words of the first book? Let's have a look. So, the first verse, familiar by now, and 7 Hebrew words have a total of 2701 by Gematria. This being the 73rd triangular number. 73 units along the base, and each side has 73 units as well. This triangle has an exact center point. Now, if you count from the base, either from the left or the right, the exact symmetrical center is the 1525th unit. There is also an alternative center at 2017. Now, this is the center because it comes in the central row, the 37th row out of 73, and this is a central unit in that row. There are 37 units on this row, and this is the 19th. So, although it is not the symmetrical center, it can be considered the topological center. There are 2 more such, at 1180 and 1198. If one counted the base as the left side, then 1198 would be the center, topologically, and if the right side was the base, then 1180 would be the center. If we add the 3 red centers, we find a total of 4395. Now that is 3 times 1465. So 1465 is an average figure for the 3 red dots. Now 1465 gives a value of a Greek name, Metonos. And Metonos, who lived in the 5th century BCE, was famous for his apparent discovery of the metonic cycle. Well, certainly he gave his name to it, and this is a calendrical cycle which measures or synchronizes the phases of the moon and the sun. And the full cycle is 19 solar years, which is exactly equal to 235 lunar months. This was what was being measured by the Antikythera mechanism. This, as you may know, was a brass instrument, a computer, made in ancient Greece, probably around 200 BCE, and found on a shipwreck which sunk about 70 BCE. And this device measured eclipse cycles and the metonic calendrical cycle. The metonic cycle actually formed the basis of the Hebrew calendar, as it still does today. It was the basis of the Babylonian calendar, the Greek calendar, and it was extremely well known to the ancient Egyptians. Now, if we add the symmetrical center, the blue dot, to the 3 topological centers, we get a new total of 5,920. To this, we can add the 3 corners, which come as the units 1, 73 and 2701. This provides a new grand total for the 7 locations of 8,695. This is a significant number as it forms the product of 37 and 235. Remember that there are 235 lunar months in the metonic cycle of 19 solar years. This is the cycle which was measured by the Antikythera mechanism. Now, in a way, it would be perhaps more gratifying to see 19 times 235 as the total of those 7 points. However, 19 and 37 are intrinsically linked in a number of different ways. We find, for example, that 19 is the midpoint towards 37 and can actually form the hinge of a plane gnomon of total value 37. A gnomon is a Greek word which means a sundial or a calendrical device, a device for marking the passage of time. In terms of geometry, a gnomon is the addition to a polygon in 2 dimensions or a polyhedron in 3 dimensions, which increases that figure by 1 order of magnitude. So a plane gnomon is basically a right angle or an L shape which is 1 larger than the previous L shape. We also see that the sum of the first 37 numbers is 19 times 37. If we go to 3 dimensions, we can consider a cube of side 3 and a cube of side 4. The first has 27 units in its volume, and the 4 by 4 by 4 cube has 64. Now, there is a sequence related to this whereby you take out a 2 by 2 cube from the 3 by 3 or a 3 by 3 cube from the 4 by 4. And that will leave a solid gnomon of 19 units for the 3 by 3 or 37 units for the 4 by 4. So there is a perfect sequence of numbers where 19 and 37 are consecutive measures of 3-dimensional gnomons. Now, let's go screaming ahead to Genesis chapters 2 and 3, where we find the first 2 people appear. In Genesis 2:21, we find, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man." In the next chapter we find her name, and Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. Now, in this story, there are 3 important components: Adam, rib, and Eve. In the Hebrew, we find Adam and rib have a value of 235. And Eve, yeah, you guessed it, her name adds up to 19. So Adam and Eve portray the basic figures of the Metonic cycle. Now, let's go back to the first chapter. We saw the first verse, and we can add to that the second verse. "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." This adds 14 more words in Hebrew, and the first 2 verses have a grand total of 6,247. This ought to have an important symbolic meaning, and we find especially it should because St. John copied it in his 6th verse. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The Greek has 8 words, and they sum to 6,247. Now, in another video, I have shown how St. John used that figure of 6247 to present the introduction of Jesus into his story, Jesus and John. And initially, I wasn't quite sure why 6247 was used in Genesis. But I found out when I made a square of 6247 perimeter. And around that square I drew a circle. And the diameter of the circle is 6,939, which takes us right back to the Metonic cycle. Because we find that 19 solar years is exactly 365.2422 times 19 equals 6,939.6 days. In terms of the moon, 235 lunar months is 29.5306 times 235, or 6,939.7 days. We also notice that 6247, the original number, the digits add up to 19, just in case we weren't sure. Now, the actual circumference of the circle is 6,938.67, which really needs the addition of 1 to make it perfect. Now, fortunately, within the Jewish Kabbalah, there is a mechanism by which one can add 1 to any number. This is called kolel, coming from a Hebrew word which means to make perfect. And the underlying philosophy is that the number 1 is not actually a number, it is God, the unity. And the number 1 can come and go as it pleases. So this number 6938.67 can be made perfect through the addition of kolel. Now, modern mathematicians might see this as a fudge, but it has to be remembered that the Kabbalah was a strictly oral tradition, and the addition of 1 here or there could be part of the oral teaching and an important part. So it is not invalid to say that 1 should be added to the total to make it perfect. There is one more piece of finesse, which is rather neat and perhaps explains why 6247 was chosen rather than 6248, which might have been otherwise a little more accurate. Because the total of the square and the circle is 13,186, which is, again, extremely relevant because it constitutes 19 squared times the number of days in the year, or just about 365.25. That, again, is a remarkable coincidence. So it can be seen that the first 2 verses of Genesis are every bit as cosmological as the cosmos verses in St. John's Gospel, chapter 1. Although Genesis measures time, calendrical cycles, whereas St. John is measuring the dimensions of the earth. But both of them were included in very simple scriptural language that can be read quite happily on the surface by those unaware of what floats beneath. If you've enjoyed this video, please click the like button, and if you want to see more, please subscribe to my channel.